The Sarreni Imperial Academy had never accepted a human before. In the 300 years since humanity had stumbled onto the galactic scene, primitive FTL drive barely functioning. Radio transmissions still leaking into space like the technological equivalent of a toddler's drool, the great powers of the Galactic Concord had regarded humans as a curiosity at best. A species that had somehow survived its violent tendencies long enough to reach the stars, but clearly not meant for the sophisticated corridors of true galactic civilization. Lieutenant Commander Elena Reyes knew all this as she stood at attention before Arch-Proctor Zivhalak, the towering, obsidian-skinned alien who oversaw the Academy's prestigious engineering corps. His four eyes, the upper pair a serene blue, the lower a calculating amber, regarded her with what she had learned to recognize as barely concealed disdain. "Human Reyes," his voice rumbled through the translator at her collar. "Your presence at the Academy continues to be unprecedented." Elena kept her face neutral. 3 months into her exchange program at the most prestigious military engineering school in the galaxy, and still every conversation began this way. "The Earth Coalition appreciates the opportunity, Arch-Proctor," she replied, the diplomatic response drilled into her by Admiral Chen before she'd left Earth. "Don't make waves. Don't embarrass humanity." This exchange position took 40 years of negotiation to secure. Indeed. Zivhalak's upper eyes blinked slowly. "You are aware of tomorrow's Rift Canyon Traverse?" "Yes, Arch-Proctor. The final practical exam for third-cycle engineers. You will participate." Elena felt her heart rate spike. The Rift Canyon Traverse wasn't just any test, it was the legendary challenge that separated the merely competent from the truly brilliant engineers in the Concord. A practical field exam where students were tasked with crossing a massive, geologically unstable canyon on the Academy's training moon. Many careers had been made or broken on that barren, windswept terrain. "Sir, I'm honored, but I'm only in the first cycle of the exchange program. The Traverse is typically reserved for." The Sarreni High Command has expressed interest in evaluating human capabilities more directly. The Arch-Proctor's lower, amber eyes narrowed. "Unless you feel unprepared." And there it was. The trap. Refuse and confirm every prejudice about human inferiority. Accept and likely fail spectacularly in front of the Academy's elite. Elena straightened her spine. "I would be honored to represent Earth in the Traverse, sir." "Excellent." Was that amusement in his multi-toned voice? "You'll report to Hangar Bay 7 at first light. No preparation materials will be provided, as is tradition." "Understood, sir." Dismissed Human Reyes. The mess hall fell silent when Elena entered. Hundreds of alien faces, Sarreni, Voth, Tessic, and a dozen other species all turned to stare. News traveled fast in the Academy. "The little human is joining the Traverse," a voice called out, the translator rendering the Tessic's clicking speech into flat standard. How quaint. Elena ignored the comment, making her way to the far corner where a single figure sat alone. Vrax, a Kalari engineer and the closest thing she had to a friend at the Academy. His scaled skin shimmered with green bioluminescent patterns, the Kalari equivalent of a concerned frown. "You've heard," Elena said, setting down her tray. "Everyone's heard," Vrax replied, his six-fingered hand wrapping around a nutrient cube. "The Arch-Proctor is setting you up to fail, Elena. Tell me something I don't know. The Traverse this year is at Carrick's Rift." Elena's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "The volcanic fissure?" "The very same. 16 kilometers across, unstable terrain, thermal vents, magnetic interference that disrupts most standard Concord technology." Vrax's luminescent patterns pulsed with worry. "Even for third-cycle students, it's considered exceptionally challenging." "Perfect," Elena muttered. "The Sarreni have been particularly vocal about human inclusion in the Academy. They believe your species lacks the patience and sophistication for true engineering excellence." Vrax leaned forward. "They say humans are too reliant on brute force solutions." Elena smiled thinly. they're not entirely wrong about that last part. This isn't funny, Elena. No first cycle student has ever attempted the traverse, let alone A primitive human? She finished for him. Vrax had the decency to look embarrassed, his scales dimming slightly. I was going to say exchange student. Look, I get it. This is a setup. But backing down isn't an option. Not for me, and not for Earth. Elena pushed her food around her plate. So tell me everything you know about Carrick's Rift. Dawn on Taraxis Minor, the Academy's training moon, painted the sky in shades of burnt orange and deep purple as the gas giant it orbited dominated the horizon. Elena stood with 19 other students at the edge of Carrick's Rift, a jagged wound in the moon's surface that seemed to stretch to infinity in both directions. Steam and noxious gases vented from the canyon floor kilometers below. The far side was barely visible through the haze, a distant cliff wall that represented either triumph or humiliation. Arch-Proctor Zivhalak stood on a hovering platform, addressing the assembled students. Engineers of the Concord build the impossible. His voice boomed across the assembly. For 12,000 years, the Empire has connected worlds, harnessed stars, and brought order to chaos. Today, you will demonstrate your worthiness to join this legacy. His upper eyes swept across the gathered students, pausing fractionally longer on Elena. The parameters are simple. Cross Carrick's Rift using only the materials provided to your team. He gestured to the supply crates behind each student. You may form alliances or work independently. The evaluation period ends at sunset. Those who have not crossed by then have failed. Elena glanced at her assigned crate. Even from a distance, she could see it was smaller than those assigned to the Sarreni students. One final note, the Arch-Proctor added. As you are aware, standard gravitic technology is unreliable within the rift due to magnetic interference. Creative solutions will be necessary. With a gesture, he activated a holographic countdown timer. You have one planetary rotation. Begin. The students rushed to their supply crates. Elena jogged to hers, aware of the dismissive glances from the others. When she reached her crate and forced open the seal, she understood why. While the other students received advanced alloys, energy cores, force field generators, and other high-tech components, her crate contained primitive tools, manual welding equipment, basic structural materials, ancient mechanical winches, and chemical adhesives. Nothing powered by the quantum technologies the Concord took for granted. Human technology for the human, called out a tall Sarreni student, Varric, to appreciative laughter. Perhaps they'll let you throw rocks across next time. Elena ignored them, methodically inventorying what she had. The equipment was primitive by Concord standards, but she recognized most of it. Some was even similar to what she'd trained with back on Earth's lunar engineering facility. The other students quickly formed 3 teams, predictably divided along species lines, Sarreni with Sarreni, Voth with Voth, the handful of other species clustering together. No one approached Elena. Might I join you? Came a familiar voice. Vrax stood awkwardly nearby, his scales pulsing with nervous patterns. You sure about that? Elena asked. Your career prospects might take a hit. Vrax's mouth formed the Kalari approximation of a smile. I've always been curious about primitive engineering approaches. Gee, thanks. That was a joke, Elena. I've reviewed your Earth Coalition file. Before the exchange, you specialized in extreme environment construction. Elena nodded, feeling a small spark of hope. Maybe this wouldn't be a complete disaster after all. So, Vrax said, peering into her meager supply crate, what's the human approach to crossing an uncrossable canyon? Elena surveyed the volcanic rift again, her mind already calculating possibilities. The same thing humans have been doing for thousands of years when faced with a gap. She smiled. We build a bridge. 3 hours later, most of the student teams were still in the planning and construction phase. The Sarreni team had created an elaborate system of force field stepping stones, but the magnetic interference was proving problematic, causing fields to collapse unexpectedly. The Voth were constructing what appeared to be a large catapult mechanism. while the mixed species team was attempting to harness the thermal vents to power a massive hover platform. Elena and Vrax worked steadily at the edge of the cliff, drawing curious and contemptuous glances from the others. "This can't possibly work," Vrax muttered, helping Elena secure another cable to the cliff face. "It's a primitive solution," Elena agreed, wiping sweat from her brow. The environment suits the Academy provided were designed for Sarreni physiology and ran hot for humans. But sometimes primitive works when advanced fails. Their approach was deceptively simple: a suspension bridge using high-tension cables anchored to the cliff face, supporting a lightweight walkway. No force fields, no anti-gravity, no quantum uncertainty matrices. Just tension, compression, and the unyielding laws of physics that worked the same on Earth as they did across the galaxy. "The calculations are critical," Elena explained as they worked. "Too much tension, and the cables snap. Too little, and the bridge sags into the volcanic vents below. But without computational assistance, we do it the old-fashioned way." Elena tapped her temple. In mental math and educated guesses, refined by thousands of years of human engineering tradition. "Fascinating," Vrax admitted, his scales pulsing with genuine interest now. "On my world, we haven't used physical bridges in over 4,000 years. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways," Elena replied, securing another anchor point. "Especially when electromagnetic interference makes your fancy tech unreliable." By midday, their bridge began to take shape. Elena had designed a launcher little more than a glorified crossbow to fire the initial guide cables across the canyon. With those in place, they began the laborious process of reinforcing the structure. Arch-Proctor Zivhalak's hover platform drifted over periodically, his 4 eyes betraying nothing as he observed their progress. The other students, initially dismissive, began casting increasingly concerned glances toward Elena's project as their own sophisticated solutions continued to falter in the rift's challenging conditions. "The Sarreni are getting nervous," Vrax noted during a brief water break. "Varric has been watching us for the past hour." Elena nodded, taking a swig from her canteen. "They should be. We're going to beat them across." "You sound very confident for someone building a bridge out of metal sticks and string," Vrax said, but his bioluminescent patterns betrayed his growing excitement. "Cables and composite struts," Elena corrected with a grin. "And yes, I am confident. Because unlike them, I'm not trying to outsmart the canyon. I'm working with it." It was nearly the Academy's equivalent of 1,400 hours when disaster struck. The Voth team's catapult misfired dramatically, sending their payload and one unfortunate Voth student into the mixed species team's thermal collector. The resulting explosion damaged part of the cliff face and sent a shower of debris cascading into the canyon. One large boulder smashed directly into the central span of Elena's bridge. "No," she shouted, rushing to the edge. The bridge swayed dangerously, partially collapsed in the middle, hanging by only a few cables. "It's over," Vrax said, his scales dimming to a dull green. "We can't repair that kind of structural damage with what we have left." Elena stared at the damaged bridge, her mind racing through possibilities. The sun was already beginning to sink toward the horizon. A few more hours, and they would fail. "We're not done yet," she said finally. "Elena, be reasonable. Reasonable is what got us into this mess." She snapped, then took a deep breath. "Sorry, but listen, we don't need to fix the whole bridge." "What do you mean?" Elena pointed to the far side. "We just need to get across. One person." Vrax's eyes widened. "You can't be serious." "Dead serious. Help me reconfigure these cables." As sunset approached, none of the teams had successfully crossed the rift. The Sarreni's force fields continued to fail at unpredictable intervals. But the Voth were attempting to rebuild their catapult after the accident. The mixed species team had abandoned their original plan entirely and were now trying to construct a primitive glider. Arch-Proctor Zivhalak's platform hovered near the cliff edge, his posture radiating smug satisfaction as he watched the clock tick down. Attention, his voice boomed. 1 standard hour remains in the evaluation period. Elena stood at the edge of the cliff, secured to what remained of their bridge by a complex harness of cables and mechanical winches. "This is suicide," Vrax hissed, checking her connections one last time. "It's high school physics," Elena replied with more confidence than she felt. "Angular motion. I swing across the gap using the remaining tension in the cables. And if the calculations are wrong?" Elena gave him a tight smile. "Then you'll have fascinating data on human terminal velocity to share with your xenobiology class." Before Vrax could object further, Elena took a deep breath and stepped off the cliff. The harness caught her, cables snapping taut with a sound like gunshots. She swung out over the abyss, the heat from the volcanic vents below washing over her in waves. For a terrifying moment, she thought they had miscalculated, that she wouldn't clear the damaged central section of the bridge. She swung past it by meters, arcing up toward the far cliff face. The momentum wasn't quite enough to reach the edge, but it brought her close enough to the far anchor points of their bridge. Hanging in space, Elena activated the mechanical winch at her belt, slowly pulling herself up the remaining distance. Hand over hand, muscles screaming, she climbed the final 20 meters to the cliff edge. With one last heave, she pulled herself over the rim and collapsed onto solid ground. On the far side, she could see Vrax jumping up and down, his scales flashing brilliant patterns of excitement. The other students had stopped their work to stare in disbelief. Even Arch-Proctor Ziv Halak's hover platform seemed to hang motionless in shock. Elena rose to her feet, brushed the dust from her environment suit, and activated her communicator. "Human engineer Reyes reporting successful crossing of Carrick's Rift," she announced, unable to keep a note of triumph from her voice. Bridge construction and manual traverse completed, and she checked her chronometer, 5 hours and 42 minutes. The return journey to the academy was silent. Elena sat alone in the transport shuttle, still filthy and exhausted from her crossing. None of the other students, all of whom had failed the challenge, would meet her eyes. Arch-Proctor Ziv Halak summoned her to his office as soon as they landed. He stood at the window, gazing out at the academy's sprawling campus, his back to her when she entered. "Human Reyes," he said without turning. "Your performance today was unexpected." "Thank you, Arch-Proctor." It was not a compliment. Now he turned, all 4 eyes fixed on her. "You were given inadequate materials deliberately. The test was designed to demonstrate the limitations of your species." Elena felt her temper flare but kept her face neutral. "With respect, sir, the test was designed to challenge us to cross a canyon using available resources. I did exactly that, using primitive methods that have been obsolete for millennia, using methods that worked when advanced technology failed." Elena met his gaze steadily. "Isn't that the true test of an engineer? Finding solutions that work regardless of the circumstances?" For a long moment, the Arch-Proctor stared at her. Then, to her surprise, his upper eyes blinked in what she had learned was a Sarreni gesture of acknowledgement. "Perhaps," he admitted, "there is something to be said for diverse approaches." He moved to his desk and activated a holographic display. "The High Command has reviewed the data from today's exercise. Your solution was unorthodox, but undeniably effective. It has prompted some reconsideration regarding human participation in the Academy. Sir, the exchange program will be expanded. 6 more human engineers will join next cycle." The words seemed to cause him physical discomfort. "And you, human Reyes, will advance directly to 2nd cycle studies." Elena struggled to keep her expression professional. "I'm honored, Arch-Proctor. Do not become overconfident. This is merely a recognition that your species may have certain applicable skills." He deactivated the display. "The Concord faces challenges across thousands of worlds. Some of those challenges may benefit from approaches that are less sophisticated but more adaptable." It was as close to a compliment as she was likely to get. "Understood, sir. If I may ask, what made you change your mind?" Ziv Halak was silent for a moment. "During the 3 hours you constructed your bridge, I observed 19 of our best students attempt to solve the problem with our most advanced technology. All failed. You succeeded using materials that predated our civilization's spaceflight era. His upper eyes blinked again. There may be value in such resilience. Later that evening, Elena sat with Vrax in the Academy's observation dome, watching the gas giant rise over the horizon, casting prismatic light across the campus. "You've become something of a legend already," Vrax said, his scales pulsing with amusement. "The human who built a bridge when the Sarreni couldn't cross a gap." Elena laughed. "I think that's overstating it a bit." "Not according to the message boards. Students are already analyzing your approach. There's talk of integrating physical engineering fundamentals back into the core curriculum." Vrax's pattern shifted to one of curiosity. "Why did you think of a bridge, when everyone else was trying to fly or teleport or hover?" Elena considered the question, watching the stars emerge above them. "Humans have been crossing obstacles since we first walked upright. Rivers, canyons, mountains, they all stood in our way. We learned early that sometimes the simplest solution is to build a connection from here to there." She smiled. "We're bridge builders, Vrax. It's in our DNA." "Well, your bridge has connected more than just two cliffs," Vrax replied. "Word from the diplomatic corps is that the Sarreni are reconsidering their position on human expansion in the Antares sector." "Because I swung across a canyon?" "Because you demonstrated that humans might approach problems differently than the Concord has for thousands of years." Vrax's scales rippled with emphasis. "In a galaxy where most civilizations have solved the same problems the same ways for millennia, different perspectives are valuable." Elena watched as a message notification appeared on her datapad, a congratulatory note from Admiral Chen back on Earth, along with news that the coalition was fast-tracking diplomatic relations with 3 previously resistant Concord species. All because she'd built a bridge. "You know what's funny?" she said finally. "On Earth, bridge building is considered one of our oldest, most traditional engineering disciplines. Nothing exciting or revolutionary about it." "Perhaps that's the revolution," Vrax replied. "Remembering old solutions when new problems arise." Elena nodded, watching the stars. Somewhere out there, humanity was taking its first real steps into the galactic community, no longer dismissed as primitive upstarts, but recognized for the unique perspective they brought to a civilization that had perhaps grown too comfortable in its advancement. All it had taken was a bridge, one span across an impossible gap. Humanity had been building those for thousands of years.